Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you're here because today I want to share with you a story that has been tucked away in my heart for more than half a century. One that began in a small American town in the 1960s and has echoes that still resonate with us today. My name is Grandma Martha, and at 78 years young, I've seen more of life's highs and lows than I ever dreamed possible when I was an innocent girl growing up in Oakwood, Kentucky. But before we dive into all of that, let me tell you why I believe this story matters so much, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever faced heartbreak, injustice, or the desperate urge to start over. Back in the day, Oakwood was your quintessential Mayberry type town, cobblestone streets, white steepled church, and neighbors who knew your business before you even finished telling the story. As a teenager in the 1960s, I already felt the walls closing in on me. Society expected me to follow a well-worn path, help my mother at home learn enough reading and writing to keep a household ledger, go to church on Sundays, and wait patiently for a proposal from some boy in a clean shirt and tie. And while that life might have been perfectly fine, for many girls in my small world, I was different. I had this enormous curiosity about the wider world. Paris, Rome, New York City, all places I knew only from borrowed library books, dog-eared magazines, and the dreams I scribbled in the margins of my notebook late at night under the hush of a single candle flame. So why does any of this matter to you? Watching me from your living room in Chicago, or perhaps a cafe in San Francisco. Because no matter where or when we live, none of us are completely free from the pressure to fit in to be the good daughter, the ideal wife, the perfect neighbor, or whatever label society hands us. And we all carry dreams in our hearts, some small and domestic, others wild and ambitious. And sometimes, when we reach for those dreams, we can be met with the most terrifying resistance from the world around us, or, heartbreakingly, from those we love most. In recent years, memoirs like Tara Westover's Educated and Jeanette Walz's The Glass Castle have shown how personal stories of family struggle and self-discovery can resonate so deeply with readers across the country. What draws us in is the raw honesty, the courage to confront painful truths, and the ultimate message of resilience, that even when the foundations of our lives crumble, we can find a way to rebuild. My story is in that same tradition, only it began decades before those books were published, and it took me years to find my own voice to tell it. Imagine the sting of realizing that the very thing you love, the person who makes your heart feel like it's floating on air, could become the starting point of your worst nightmare. Imagine learning you're pregnant with the child of the man you love, only to have your own father turn against you in a rage that shatters your world. And then imagine fighting with every ounce of strength left in your battered body to survive and to forge a new path when it feels like all hope has been snuffed out. I share this not to burden you with sorrow, but because I believe stories like mine can be a light in the darkness for someone who might be going through their own storm right now. It doesn't matter whether that storm takes the form of family conflict, societal expectations, or personal health crises, because in each case, the question becomes the same. How do we pick up the pieces and carry on? How do we find the strength to believe in ourselves when the world seems determined to tell us we have no right to hope? Over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the beginning of my journey, the innocent girl full of dreams, the whirlwind romance with John, the shattering betrayal, and the desperate flight to find refuge with my aunt in Louisville. Along the way, I'll highlight key moments and reflections that I hope will offer insight and encouragement to anyone who's ever faced a life-altering crisis. We'll also look briefly at some parallels in today's society, how the echoes of Oakwood still reverberate in small towns and big cities alike, reminding us that issues like domestic violence, forced honor conflicts, and the struggle for women's autonomy have not simply vanished with the passing decades. So pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea, get comfortable, and let's begin at the very start, where dreams ignite and the first currents of change begin to stir. We'll pick up the story of that curious young girl in Oakwood in the next section, exploring how her world was shaped by family tradition, small-town gossip, and the quiet yearning for something more. From there, we'll step into the festival, where she first met the man whose camera lens would open new horizons, and tragically, unleash a chain of events no one could have foreseen. See you in the next part, where our journey truly begins. Oakwood was the sort of place where the morning church bells summoned half the town into the pews, where the hardware store owner knew exactly whose roof needed new shingles, and where Mrs. Donahue at the diner could make you a bacon and eggs breakfast and a sympathetic ear whether you'd asked for it or not. At its heart, Oakwood was proud of its sense of community. Neighbors looked out for one another, and traditions were passed down like heirlooms. But that same tight-knit spirit could turn claustrophobic for someone like me, a daydreamer with books tucked under her arm and fantasies of far-off cities scribbled in the margins of her notebook. On the surface, life in Oakwood wasn't harsh. Families worked hard. My father, Mr. Anthony, was the town's stonemason, known for building half the houses on Main Street. My mother, Elizabeth, sewed everything from Sunday best to everyday work clothes with needle-sharp precision and pride. Folks got by on modest wages, but pride in a job well done seemed to feed the soul more than any paycheck. On Saturday nights, there'd be a dance at the barn behind the church or a screening of a Western at the little movie house on Elm, and everyone would turn out in their best dresses, hemmed by loving hands, shoes shined until they gleamed. But below that gentle surface flowed a current of expectation. Girls from respectable families were meant to behave a certain way, quiet, obedient, and content, with marriage, children, and a lifetime spent running a household. Education beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic was considered superfluous for a woman whose horizon was assumed to end at the front door of her future home. My mother was allowed to stitch and preserve her creativity in fabric. I was told, gently but firmly, that my dreams of becoming an accomplished lady would come in the form of needlework, flower arranging, and making polite conversation. Anything bolder, art history, foreign languages, or the notion that I might want to be a writer was quietly discouraged, as if those ambitions might warp the proper trajectory of a young woman's life. In Oakwood, gossip traveled faster than the mail. If you left a note for your friend at the diner, by lunchtime, everyone would know exactly what you'd written. The townspeople took pride in their vigilance, believing that moral order was best maintained when every misstep, no matter how small, was observed, discussed, and judged. This small-town mentality carried two faces. On the one hand, it ensured a kind of social safety net, where someone in trouble rarely went unnoticed. On the other, it built invisible walls around anyone like me who dared to think differently. I remember once boldly asking my third-grade teacher to recommend books about Paris. I hadn't even visited France, but the idea of walking along the Seine in the spring made my heart pound. She smiled kindly, but whispered, "Martha, those stories are lovely, but perhaps you should stick to reading about things closer to home." That decision to redirect me toward local history pamphlets instead of Jules Verne felt small at the time, but lingered like a sigh, a reminder that while the world was vast, my place in it was supposed to be very small indeed. Sunday for us was a multi-hour affair church service at 10 a.m. The obligatory potluck luncheon with casseroles and banana pudding, and often a second service or choir practice that felt more like an invitation to witness and be witnessed. I loved the hymns, the hush that fell when Reverend Collins spoke, and the scent of fresh iris and honeysuckle in the churchyard. Yet I struggled with the eyes that watched me too closely, measuring every gesture for piety. If a young woman walked home from the church steps arm in arm with a young man, the whispers started. If a young lady laughed too freely at the potluck, the tongues wagged. Even something as innocuous as wearing lipstick past the church door could inspire scandalized commentary. "She's growing too bold," or "don't know what she's aiming for." In Oakwood, modesty wasn't just a personal choice, it was a public contract. Though Oakwood wasn't impoverished, opportunities for upward mobility were scarce. The factories in the nearest city were a 2-hour drive away. Local shops rarely hired young women beyond the summer tourist season, when Oakwood's waterfalls and historic homes attracted visitors. My older brother Tony learned the stonemasonry trade from our father, hands-on, honest work that provided a steady living. My younger sister Grace was just a child when Oakwood became her whole world. But for me, the choice seemed stark. Marry a good man who promised stability, or strike out on my own into a world that few here ever saw. It's easy to underestimate how much a place like Oakwood can shape your sense of what's possible. When your neighbors never leave town and your teachers never return from college, it becomes almost natural to conclude that the world beyond the ridge is dangerous, frivolous, or simply not for you. And yet, the flame of curiosity can burn brighter in such isolation, because even a sliver of light, a chance glimpse at what lies beyond, can become a beacon. You might be thinking, "Grandma Martha, that sounds quaint," but small towns today have cell phones, high-speed internet, and weekend festivals featuring food trucks. And you'd be right, Oakwood in 2025 would look quite different from Oakwood circa 1965. Yet, beneath the surface changes. Many of the invisible forces remain the same. Social norms can still be rigid gossip, still spreads through social media, and the pressure to conform can be just as real. Take, for instance, the phenomenon of cancel culture. In modern small communities, one misstep posted online can lead to weeks and sometimes months of social ostracism. Or consider how local attitudes toward women's roles can persist even when legal barriers have fallen. The expectation that mothers be the primary caregivers, or that successful women must choose family over career, are echoes of that very same mindset I faced in Oakwood. For every girl in Oakwood who quietly accepted her destiny, there were a few like me who felt those walls closing in and began to press against them in small ways. I would linger after school in the library, tracing my finger along maps of Europe. I kept a stack of John Steinbeck novels hidden beneath my mattress, and I practiced sketching the old church steeple in charcoal, imagining one day I might sell those drawings for enough money to buy a ticket out of town. What may have seemed like harmless daydreaming, was in reality the first stirrings of rebellion, a quiet but powerful refusal to let my life be defined by others. And, although I didn't know it at the time, those tiny acts of curiosity, the borrowed books, the sketches in the margins, were the prod that would lead me to cross paths with someone who saw the world as I did. Community is a double-edged sword. Oakwood taught me that community can be both caring and stifling. The same people who brought casseroles to your door could also spread damaging rumors. Realizing this dual nature of community is vital. It reminds us to value support networks while guarding our independence. Visibility can be a burden. When everyone knows your business, privacy becomes a luxury. In today's terms, that's like living under a perpetual social media microscope. The lesson here is to create personal boundaries, even when those boundaries feel hard to maintain. Respect tradition, but question it too. Traditions have value, they root us in place and give us a sense of belonging. But without critical reflection, tradition can morph into limitation. Learning when to honor the past and when to challenge it is a skill that shapes every meaningful journey. Dreams thrive on small sparks. In a world where the horizon looks narrow, even a single magazine photo or a line from a novel can ignite a passion that reshapes your destiny. Never underestimate the power of small, consistent acts of curiosity. This portrait of Oakwood in the 1960s may feel like a different planet, but I hope you see the threads that still run through our modern lives, whether you're in a quiet, rural county or the hustle of a major metropolis. Those invisible walls, the silent expectations, and the hidden pressures are still with us. But so too are the sparks of curiosity, the desire for something more, and the small acts of courage that begin with a borrowed book or a secret pencil sketch. In the next section, we'll meet John, the young man from Washington, D.C., whose camera lens drew me out of my comfortable confines and set in motion events that would forever alter my life. We'll explore how our worlds collided and what it felt like, for the very first time, to glimpse a life unbound by cobblestone streets and whispered judgments. Thank you for staying with me through this journey back in time. I can't wait to share what happened next. It was a bright Sunday afternoon at the annual Fall Festival Pumpkins. On every porch, homemade apple cider steaming in tin mugs, and the scent of candied nuts drifting through the air. I was helping my mother serve slices of her famous pecan pie when I noticed him, for the first time, a tall young man with dark hair, brushing his collar, a camera slung casually around his neck, and a smile that seemed to light up the entire square. He introduced himself simply, "I'm John, assistant to Mr. Gerald, the photographer. Mind if I photograph you?" And there it was, the polite question that felt like a declaration of possibility. He wasn't like any boy I'd known. Whereas the local boys mumbled compliments through their sisters or handed shy notes, John spoke directly, confidently, with genuine interest. He told me he'd grown up in Washington, D.C., a city still finding its stride in the 1960s, a place of monuments and protests, jazz clubs, and high-pressure politics. He'd seen museums and theaters. He'd ridden the metro and watched newsreels in downtown cinemas. To him, Oakwood's cobblestones and gossip-hung porches were curiosities, not limitations. And to me, his world felt like a promise of cinema reels, flickering with possibilities of camera shutters, freezing moments in time, of conversations about faraway places that sounded like invitations rather than warnings. But in Oakwood, nothing stays secret for long. We knew that, and so every note we passed, tucked into the pages of my library book, felt like a small act of rebellion. I would slip out under the guise of visiting my friend Catherine to study, only to find a quiet corner behind the old church where the late afternoon shadows stretched long, and no one dared to eavesdrop. There, with the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, we would sit close enough to hear each other's whispered dreams, his plans to open a studio in D.C., my hopes of reading books without fear of judgment, our shared desire to explore life beyond county lines. These clandestine moments crackled with excitement and fear in equal measure. We knew the stakes if word reached my father, Mr. Anthony, a man proud of his reputation, and suspicious of outsiders. The consequences could be dire. So our courtship unfolded, like a dance of light and shadow, each visit carefully planned for Sundays after church, each goodbye guarded by a promise of more to come. Looking back, I see now that our secret romance mirrors countless stories from Romeo and Juliet sneaking through moonlit balconies to modern dramas of lovers divided by creed or clan. The difference, of course, is that our story took place not on a Venetian terrace, but in the hush of a mid-Kentucky churchyard, and the divide felt every bit as insurmountable. Beyond the thrill of secrecy lay the deeper challenge of cultural difference. John spoke of jazz clubs on U Street in Natchez, where Duke Ellington had once played. I had grown up listening to hymns in a wooden pew. He mentioned Independence Day parades in D.C., complete with marching bands and horse-drawn carriages. I could only imagine them from photographs. Our conversations were a bridge between two Americas, his a city of policy and protest, newsprint and neon lights. Mine, a world of morning dew on apple trees, hoot owl, calls in the distance, and families gathered round a potluck table. Rather than shrink from these differences, we embraced them. He taught me how to hold a camera properly, how the lens needed to be steady, how light transformed every scene. I taught him the names of local wildflowers, how to coax the best flavor from a homemade pie, and the art of reading the sky to predict a storm. Each exchange broadened our horizons, reminding us that culture isn't a barrier, but a tapestry woven from countless threads of tradition, language, and belief. Of course, secret romances carry hidden dangers. When love grows in the shade, it can thrive on fear as much as on affection. I remember the spinning nausea of adrenaline each time I saw John's blue Volkswagen pull up outside my house. Would my mother notice? Would my father confront him on the porch? We risked everything for these stolen moments, and that very intensity made us reckless. We sent cryptic letters in trusted friends to relay messages, and sometimes stayed out past curfew, hearts pounding. Later, I realized that skipping the step of open communication and trying to hide from consequences would magnify the fallout when our secret finally came to light. In any relationship, hiding essential truths creates a foundation of fear. A love that cannot breathe in daylight can suffocate in shadows. That's not to say all discretion is bad. Some privacy is a healthy guardrail, but when secrets protect shame rather than sanctify trust, we build castles on sand. What John and I discovered, and what I hope you'll carry with you, is that differences can enrich rather than divide, so long as we approach them with humility and curiosity. In our case, The blend of small-town sincerity and big-city cosmopolitanism created a bond that felt both exhilarating and grounding. I learned that city slickers can appreciate the quiet dignity of rural life just as small-town folks can marvel at the pulse of a metropolis. The trick, as with any partnership, is to listen more than you speak, to ask open-ended questions, to resist the urge to correct, and to find shared values beneath superficial contrasts. Consider these takeaways. Celebrate curiosity. When someone shows genuine interest in your world, your customs, your language, your pantry, stocking rituals, view it as an invitation, not a threat. Share traditions. A handwritten apple pie recipe can open hearts just as a jazz record can unlock ears. Traditions are best enjoyed when they're given and received in turn. Guard against assumptions. It's easy to assume that city life equates to progress, or that small-town ways mean backwardness. In truth, every place harbors both wisdom and blind spots. Balance. Privacy and honesty. It's natural to want private moments in any relationship, but be wary of letting secrecy grow into shame. If you're hiding your partner from your family, or vice versa, ask why, and whether the concealment is healthy. By the time winter rolled around, with its icy mornings and bare branches silhouetted against pale skies, our secret courtship had blossomed into something deeper than infatuation. I felt alive in a way I never had before. Every nervous heartbeat, every stolen kiss, every shared laugh felt like a promise. John spoke of taking me to D.C., to meet his friends, to wander the Smithsonian halls, to see cherry blossoms in bloom. I drank in every word, daring to imagine that a life beyond Oakwood might actually be possible. That moment, when two hearts fully recognize each other's potential, remains one of the most vivid of my life. It was as if the small town boundaries dissolved, replaced by a map with bold new lines drawn to places we had yet to explore. And yet, even at the height of that hope, we both sensed the undercurrents of risk, the disapproval of my father, the skepticism of neighbors, the thin line between excitement and recklessness. In our next chapter, we'll see how hope and fear intertwined to propel us into uncharted territory. The day John mustered the courage to ask my father for permission, the delicate negotiations that followed, and the fateful choices that set the stage for tragedy. We'll explore how a single moment of defiance can spark a wildfire of consequences, and what it taught me about love, honor, and the limits of familial authority. 6 months into our secret courtship, John and I felt as though we were living in two worlds at once. The hours we spent behind the old church, nestled in the hush of afternoon shadows, were ours alone. But every Sunday, before the morning service, my heart would hammer in my chest as I waited to see if he would keep his promise to come. And he always did, stepping off the dusty road in his crisp shirt and tie, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked along the way. One chilly November morning, as frost still glittered on the fence rails, John arrived at my front door, clutching a simple bouquet and wearing his most respectful smile. I could see the nervous excitement in his eyes. He told me later he'd barely slept the night before, and in that moment, I knew exactly what he meant to ask. He'd rehearsed his words on the drive over, but when he took my father's hand that morning on our porch, I saw his voice tremble ever so slightly. Mershaid. Anthony, he began tipping his hat. With all due respect, I wish to ask your permission to court your daughter, Martha. The formality of it, the deep bow of his head, it all felt so foreign to the casual notes and stolen glances of our secret meetings. Still, I felt a swell of pride for John. He was doing this the right way, honoring my family's traditions, even though they felt confining. My father, seated in his special rocking chair on the porch, a throne none of us dared to claim, eyed John from head to toe as though inspecting cattle at auction. The air hung heavy for what seemed like an eternity. Then he raised an eyebrow and asked in a low, measured voice, "And why should I allow my daughter to court a young man who has no land, no family here, and works behind a camera lens?" John's reply was calm and steady. He spoke of his dreams to open a photography studio in Louisville, of the savings he'd set aside, of the respect he held for my family's reputation and faith. He told stories of his upbringing in Washington, D.C., and of how he'd fallen in love, not just with me, but with the very spirit of Oakwood, its caring neighbors, its sense of history. My mother hovered nearby, offering coffee with a hopeful smile, while my brothers peeked through the lace curtains. Tony, with a look of amused skepticism, Grace, with wide-eyed curiosity. It was a scene that blended the warmth of home with the weight of judgment. Every word, every gesture would tip the scales in one direction or the other. At last, after nearly an hour of questioning, my father leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Very well," he said, his voice like gravel. "You may court my daughter under my conditions." John nodded eagerly. He was prepared for stipulations. He had expected nothing less from the stern man who had raised me. First, my father continued, all visits must occur on Sundays after church under the family's watchful eyes. Second, you may take Martha out for ice cream in the town square only once a month, and you must return her home before sunset. Third, you must be officially engaged in 6 months, no faster, no slower. Until then, you will respect our traditions. The conditions were strict, almost suffocating. But for us, they felt like freedom. To have permission at last, even with caveats, was more than we had dared to hope. John left that morning with his bouquet, his heart full of gratitude, and mine soared alongside it as I watched him drive away in Mr. Gerald's old blue Volkswagen. In the months that followed, our courtship blossomed under the careful eye of my family. Every Sunday after church, John would come, bearing flowers, books borrowed from the Louisville library, or the occasional photograph he'd snapped of the church steeple, glowing in the afternoon light. My father, though still wary, came to appreciate John's respectful manner. He helped around the house, assisted with small repairs, and engaged in earnest conversations about politics and religion. Yet, the restrictions weighed on us. That monthly ice cream date became the high point of our month, a brief hour of sweet rebellion before we had to dash back behind the safety of my family's picket fence. We longed for longer evenings, for quiet dinners, for the mundane joys of shared life. And beneath that longing lay an urgency that grew as winter lengthened and the shadows deepened. It was during one of those clandestine moments when the world was cloaked in dusk and only the church bell's echo remained, that John whispered the words I'd been secretly longing to hear, "Marry me, Martha. I can't wait any longer." My heart leapt, even as a flicker of fear shot through me. "But Father said, we must wait 6 months," I murmured, voice trembling. "I know," John said, cradling my face in his hands. "But what does a calendar matter when we know our hearts already belong to each other?" In that golden-hued moment, we chose love over caution. We were 19 years old, brimming with the reckless confidence of youth, and we believed our passion could conquer any obstacle. What felt like a triumphant victory was in truth the first step toward a fall neither of us anticipated. You know the feeling when a secret is stretched too thin, when every heartbeat carries the dread that its next echo will betray you for us. That moment came on a bitterly cold Friday afternoon. I'd gone out under the pretense of visiting Catherine, but instead had slipped away to the churchyard. We were laughing, weaving our dreams in the frost-hazed air, when my younger brother Tony happened by with a friend. The friend, someone I scarcely recognized, snapped a photo of John and me in an embrace. The very next morning, Tony's warning came in frantic whispers. He saw the picture, Martha. Father saw it. He's gone after John. Panic clamped around my throat as I watched my father storm from the house, clutching his old hunting shotgun. The world tilted on its axis. I knew then that the violence I had always feared could become real in an instant, fueled by a twisted notion of honor that left no room for mercy. I ran panting down the dirt road toward Mr. Gerald's photography studio, every step driven by terror and love. When I burst through the door, the scene froze me in my tracks. John lay on the floor, the red carpet, now a darker crimson, his camera shattered beside him. The air reeked of gunpowder and betrayal. My father stood over him, face contorted, with a mixture of rage and grim satisfaction. "Get away from him, girl!" he barked, shotgun still smoking. "He dishonored our family." I dropped to my knees beside John, tears blurring my vision as I pressed my hands to his chest. He smiled weakly, trying to reassure me, whispering words I would never fully remember. Then, as if fate insisted on its final cruelty, my father turned those cold eyes on me. "You ruined everything," he spat. "You're dead to me." A blow followed a backhand so fierce it knocked me across the room, and in that breathless instant, I understood the depth of his conviction that my love, my choices, threatened the very fabric of his world. By the time neighbors forced their way inside and an ambulance arrived, it was too late for John. 2 gunshots, one for his heart and one for mine. I was left kneeling in blood, clutching the man I loved, against a backdrop of shattered glass and broken dreams. What followed was a nightmare of sirens and hushed accusations, of a mother's sobs and a sheriff's grim face. My father was hauled away in handcuffs, still insisting he had done what any man of honor would do. I was bundled into an ambulance, my body bruised and broken, my spirit splintered. In the days that followed, my mother, her own heart rent in two, took me to my Aunt Josephine in Louisville. It was an exile not of choice, but necessity. Oakwood had become too dangerous, too haunted by whispers of blood and scandal. I left behind everything: my home, my family's name, the hope that had once flickered so brightly in John's eyes. As the bus pulled away at dawn, I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, watching the place of my birth recede into mist. I carried only a small bundle of clothes, John's broken camera lens, and the ache in my chest that would never fully heal. Looking back now, I see how the notion of honor can be twisted into a weapon as sharp as any blade. My father believed he was erasing shame, protecting his family's name, but what he truly extinguished was a life, a love, and a future that had barely begun. In Oakwood, as in many places, both then and now, the idea that violence could restore dignity is a dangerous myth one that punishes the innocent and perpetuates cycles of pain. Yet even in this darkness, strands of light began to weave their way into my shattered world. My mother's unwavering love, Aunt Josephine's open arms, and the distant promise of a new beginning in Louisville all offered a sliver of hope. I would carry scars, visible and unseen, for the rest of my life. But I also carried John's memory, the echo of his laughter, and the knowledge that even in the face of brutal loss, love had the power to transform. In our next chapter, we will move beyond Oakwood entirely, crossing state lines into Louisville, where my journey of survival and renewal truly began. We'll meet Aunt Josephine, whose own strength and kindness taught me what it meant to rebuild from ruins. And we'll see how a young woman, broken by violence, found the courage to stitch together a new life, one thread at a time. The dawn of the day I fled Oakwood remains burned into my memory. The sky still dark, the air crisp with early autumn chill, and my heart pounding so fiercely I thought the neighbors would hear from miles away. I had packed only a small bundle of clothes stolen away in the night, with my mother's trembling help, and tucked into my skirt a refurbished locket John had given me during our first secret meeting, a lifeline to the love I had lost. Brother Tony drove me to the little Greyhound station on the edge of town. The platform was deserted, save for 2 or 3 late-shift factory workers with calloused hands and worn lunch pails. My suitcase felt heavier with every step, as though each memory I carried added its own weight. Joseph, my older brother, slipped me an envelope of money and the address of Aunt Josephine's home in Louisville. We stood there, bound by love and grief, yet divided by unspoken fears and regrets. "Take care of yourself, sis," he whispered, wiping his eyes. "And please, try to find some peace." I nodded, unable to speak, without shattering into tears. Then the bus lumbered in headlights, cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, and I climbed aboard my future, hurtling forward on 4 rubber tires and the prayers of a broken family. When the bus finally rattled into Louisville, I felt like I'd woken from a fevered dream into another form of unreality. The city's skyline was modest, no grand monuments or flashing neon, just mid-rise brick buildings, factory smokestacks, and the gentle curve of the Ohio River in the distance. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet mercifully less threatening than Oakwood. Aunt Josephine lived in a cozy 2-story house on a quiet side street lined with maples. She greeted me at the door with open arms and a soft, "Welcome home, Martha," as though I had arrived in triumph instead of defeat. Her house smelled of fresh brewed coffee and lavender soap, and everywhere I looked there were bolts of fabric, spools of thread, and half-finished quilts, tangible proof of her independence and self-reliance. Yet sanctuary and limbo are 2 sides of the same coin. In Aunt Josephine's care, I found safety, but I also discovered how unmoored I truly was. I could sleep without fear of gunshots, but I could not sleep without reliving the attack in nightmares. I had food on the table and a roof overhead, but I felt like a ghost, haunting a life that no longer belonged to me. Each morning, I wandered the small backyard, its apple tree stripped bare for winter, feeling the weight of loneliness settle in my chest. I tried to lose myself in chores, washing dishes until my fingers pruned, sweeping floors until my knees ached, folding laundry until each crease felt like a question I couldn't answer. Who am I now? What do I want? Where do I go from here? Aunt Josephine didn't pressure me to talk. She simply insisted that I learn her trade. Sit at the singer and let your hands do the talking, she would say. So I learned to thread needles again, to line up seams with exacting precision, to press fabric under a hot iron until it lay flat and true. It was the same craft my mother had taught me, but here it felt different, less a pastime for a dutiful daughter and more a lifeline for a woman clawing back her independence. The money I earned at Josephine's small sewing business was meager, barely enough to buy toiletries and bus fare, yet it was mine. I used my wages to buy a modest chest of drawers for my aunt's spare room, repaying her kindness in small installments of gratitude. I bought myself a second-hand coat, warm but frayed at the cuffs, and a journal with empty pages that beckoned me to fill them. In the hush of winter nights, as Louisville's wind rattled the window panes, I began to write. At first, I scrawled only fragments, snatches of memory lines from letters that John had written, the ache of my empty belly that once carried our child. But slowly, those scribbles turned into paragraphs and paragraphs, into pages. I realized that stitching cloth and stitching words were not so different. Both required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to bear the needle's prick without flinching. After several months in Louisville, I knew I needed more than familiar streets and family ties. My heart still felt too small for the ghosts that haunted me there. So I made a bold decision. I would go to New York City. It was a prospect that frightened me more than I cared to admit, yet the idea of living anonymously among strangers, where no one knew my past or whispered my name, felt like the only way to breathe freely. I took a bus again this time, northward along highways that passed cornfields, giving way to factories, then suburbs, and finally, the grimy mosaic of the Bronx. I disembarked at Port Authority in Midtown Manhattan, an avalanche of noise, neon, and hurried feet. I clutched my carry-on and the envelope with the address of a distant cousin, Zoe, who had promised a place to stay, at least until I found my footing. Zoe lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of Throgs Neck, a neighborhood as far removed from Oakwood as you could imagine. The roar of ferry boats, the honk of impatient drivers, the distant clatter of elevated trains, these were the background music to my first days in the city. I felt dwarfed by towering buildings, lost in a river of faces I couldn't name, and yet oddly grateful for the anonymity they provided. Zoe helped me land a job at a garment factory in the South Bronx, sewing identical sleeves on 24 blouses in an hour. The work was grueling 12-hour days, under fluorescent lights, hands rough with needle pricks, and backs bent from mitts of fabric. Yet, there was solidarity among the workers, mostly immigrants and young women like me, who shared lunchboxes, loaned elbow pads, and swapped stories of better days. But my body carried memories of violence I had tried to smother. The pregnancy I lost in Oakwood had left me with chronic pain and irregular bleeding. I resisted seeing a doctor, fear shame, and the cost of medical care held me back. Yet one night, after collapsing in a fit of cramps, Zoe insisted I go to the public clinic on 3rd Avenue. The diagnosis was grim pelvic infection, aggravated by trauma scarring that would require surgery and months of rest. "You can't keep working like this," the doctor said, pinning me with compassionate eyes. "You're going to lose more than just wages if you don't slow down." I left the clinic clutching a wad of prescriptions and a referral for surgery, but also with a sense of panic. How would I pay rent if I missed work? How would I find time to heal when each paycheck went straight toward survival? The choices felt as stark as they had. Back in Oakwood, exist in constant pain or risk everything on the promise of recovery. In those darkest days, when my body ached, my spirit flagged, and the city's clamor felt like thunder, I found moments of grace in unlikely places. There was Mrs. Margaret, an elderly Portuguese woman who became a regular at the bakery, where I sometimes grabbed a weekend loaf of bread. She would slip me extra empanadas, invite me to dinner, and offer gentle encouragement without prying into my past. She shared a small, leather-bound book of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry, saying, "These words helped me through a war. Maybe they can help you too." There was a local library branch in the Bronx where I discovered not only books, but a sense of refuge. For an hour or two, I could lose myself in Dickens or Sinclair Lewis, in volumes of poetry or history that reminded me my life was part of a larger tapestry, one in which survival and beauty often coexist. And there were the fashion sketches. I began doodling on the margins of pay stubs, a slender waist, here a delicate sleeve, there echoes of a dream. I dared not speak aloud, to create garments, not for mass production, but as art. It was a soft ember, glowing in the ashes of my wounded life, and it reminded me that even in exile, purpose can find a way to spark. Seek sanctuary, but don't settle for limbo. Safety is precious, but healing requires more than a roof overhead. It demands the courage to face our wounds and the resources to mend them. Your labor is your lifeline. Whether through stitching seams or stitching words, earning your own way restores agency. Never underestimate the dignity in honest work. Allow help to find you. Pride can keep us from meals offered or hands extended in kindness. Accept grace when it comes, even if it arrives disguised as extra empanadas or a library card. Hold fast to small sparks of hope, a line of poetry, a fashion sketch, a single stitch. They may seem insignificant, yet these are the embers that ignite transformation. In our next chapter, we will see how those small sparks of creativity and embroidery taught by Mrs. Margaret, a chance meeting with a mentor in Greenwich Village, would kindle a flame of unexpected opportunity. We'll journey deeper into the world of fashion and design, where a young woman scarred by violence discovered a new form of expression, one stitch, one dress, one dream at a time. In the weeks after my surgery in New York, I found that the hardest battles weren't fought in hospital beds, but in the quiet of my own mind. Even when the doctor cleared me to walk and sew again, my body still twinged with phantom pain. Whenever I passed a bus stop, or heard a distant whistle, or saw a camera's flash, my heart would pound in my chest. Visions of John's smile collapsing into the red carpet of that studio, my father's cold eyes, and the echo of a shotgun blast replaying in an endless loop. It took me some time to learn that what I was experiencing had a name: post-traumatic stress. I oscillated between bursts of hyper-alertness, jumping at sudden noises, scanning every room for danger, and moments of numb detachment when I could barely recall the faces of the friends who brought me soup or the pages of the books I once devoured. Nights where the worst sleep, when it came, was haunted by nightmares that felt as vivid as the day's reality. Daytime offered no reprieve. My hands shook when I tried to thread a needle, and once I startled an entire row of women on the factory floor by flinching when the sewing machine made a loud pop. In those desperate days, I fell prey to several coping pitfalls that in retrospect only deepened my loneliness, isolation. I convinced myself that no one could understand what I'd been through. So I retreated into my tiny room and avoided phone calls from family members who asked how I was doing. Overwork, fearful of facing my own thoughts, I piled shift upon shift at the garment factory, numbing my mind with exhaustion until I collapsed with flu-like symptoms. Suppressed emotion. I bottled up my tears and fears, believing that a strong woman never cries about past horrors. Avoidance. I refused invitations to socialize or attend church events because every group gathering felt too dangerous, too overwhelming. None of these tactics brought relief. Instead, they built walls around me that made even small acts of kindness feel unreachable. The turning point came when Mrs. Martinez, a seasoned union organizer at the factory, asked me one afternoon why I'd stopped participating in the weekly support circle she hosted for women workers. "You're one of us," she said softly. What happened to the girl who used to light up when she talked about designs and dreams? Her question pierced my shell. I realized that I had stopped noticing the very community that stood beside me in hours of fatigue and frustration. That evening, I showed up at the union hall, hands clammy and heart pounding, but determined. The circle was small, 5 or 6 women each, with her own story of hardship, immigration, illness, domestic strife, yet all united by the simple act of speaking and being heard. I didn't share the full horror of Oakwood that first night. Instead, I spoke of the nightmares and the shaking hands and the fear that sewing seams had somehow become an echo of that red carpet scene. Heads nodded in recognition. Trauma wears many faces, and my vulnerability was met with empathy, not judgment. Encouraged, I sought out a counselor recommended by the union, a kind woman with a gentle voice who specialized in trauma recovery. In her softly lit office, I learned grounding techniques, feeling my feet firmly on the carpet, describing objects in the room aloud, focusing on my breath when panic rose in my throat. I practiced what she called narrative therapy, piecing together the fragments of my story in a safe space so that the memories no longer carried the same explosive power. Parallel to these formal therapies was an informal remedy that felt like reclaiming a lost piece of my soul creativity. I rediscovered the sketches I'd tucked into my pay stubs, tiny flourishes of dresses, collars, sleeves, and began turning them into full illustrations in a battered sketchbook. But more than design drawings, I experimented with watercolors, washes of blue for calm evenings, splashes of red for moments of anger, shards of gold for the flashes of hope that still glimmered. One night, after a particularly harrowing flashback, I spread a large sheet of paper on the flea market coffee table, dipped the brush in black ink, and let it dance in violent arcs across the page, an abstract exorcism of fear. When I placed that finished piece on the windowsill to dry, I felt a surprising peace. I had owned the darkness by giving it shape, and in doing so, loosened its grip on my mind. I also learned that healing is rarely a solo endeavor. My circle of allies grew to include Mrs. Martinez and the factory support group, who offered solidarity in the trenches of daily life. My counselor, who guided me through the labyrinth of memory with patience and skill. Mrs. Margaret, the Portuguese baker, who continued her dinners with me, no questions asked, just warmth and listening ears. Zoe, the distant cousin, whose occasional letters reminded me of family ties that outlasted geography. Each person filled a unique role: listener, guide, advocate, friend. Together, they formed a lattice of support that held me up on days when my own strength faltered. From my experience, I distilled several key lessons that may resonate with anyone navigating the aftermath of trauma. A name can free you. Recognizing PTSD and seeking professional help is not a sign of weakness, but a crucial step toward recovery. Words give shape to chaos. Shared stories heal. Speaking your truth, even in fragments, helps transform the power of memories from chains into chapters. Creativity is a powerful ally. Art, writing, music, or any form of self-expression can act as a bridge between the internal storm and the stable ground of reality. Rest and boundaries matter. Overwork and constant self-exposure can re-traumatize us. Learning to say no to extra shifts, to loud gatherings, or to invasive questions is an act of self-preservation. Healing is non-linear. Some days feel like leaps forward. Others drag us back into old fears. Patience with the process, both with yourself and those who love you, is essential. As spring arrived in New York, its warmth and renewal coaxed me outdoors more often. I walked through blossoming parks, felt the earth's surge of life under my feet, and let the sun dissolve the shadows that clung to my shoulders. I revisited the library, borrowing books on design history and memoirs of resilience. I rejoined the factory support circle and even began helping to facilitate some sessions, offering encouragement to other women who were just beginning to speak. Most importantly, I allowed myself to dream again. The sketches in my journal grew more elaborate fashion concepts that blended his DC photography sensibilities with my small-town appreciation for handcrafted detail. I toyed with the idea of evening classes in illustration, or even pursuing a formal apprenticeship at a tiny boutique in Greenwich Village. Those concepts felt daring, almost reckless, but in the aftermath of trauma, daring can be one of the most powerful acts of self-love. In our next chapter, we will step into that very world of possibility the moment I met Catherine, a seasoned seamstress in Greenwich Village who recognized my fledgling talent and offered me a chance to transform my passion into a profession. We'll explore how mentorship and opportunity intertwined to guide me from a factory line to a studio of my own, one stitch, one sketch, one dream at a time. It began one chilly February morning in 1969 as I made my usual rounds at the fabric warehouse near Catherine Street. The plastic-wrapped bolts of silk and satin reflected the fluorescent lights in neat, cold rows. My hands, once trembling in fear, now moved with quiet confidence, matching seams, pressing edges, knotting threads, work I had honed through necessity and hope. Yet even in that routine, my heart fluttered with longing for something more creative, more expressive. That's when Mrs. Margaret appeared, as if conjured by the scent of rosewater and fresh pastries. She was by then my steadfast friend, the one who had slipped me Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry and listened without judgment to my darkest memories. In her hands, she carried a crisply folded business card. "I met a woman yesterday," she said, her eyes twinkling, "who owns a small sewing studio in Greenwich Village. She's looking for someone who knows lace and embroidery. I told her about you." My breath caught in my throat. For months, I had been sketching dresses in the margins of pay stubs, daydreaming of colors and cuts, even doodling my name, Martha, to one day grace a label. But the gulf between sketchbook fantasies and real opportunity felt as vast as the distance between the Bronx and the West Village. "Do you think she'll actually hire me?" I managed to whisper. Mrs. Margaret smiled kindly. "Only one way to find out. Here's her card. Give her a call." That afternoon, with my fingers shaking just enough to betray my nerves, I dialed the number. A voice answered firm, yet warm, inviting me for a meeting the following Monday. As I hung up, the sheer improbability of it all washed over me. Yet beneath the tremor of excitement lay a kernel of belief. Perhaps this was the moment when I could start building a life not defined by loss, but by creation. Greenwich Village in 1969 was a world away from the stifling conformity of Oakwood and the survival mode factories of the Bronx. Sidewalks teemed with avant-garde galleries, jazz clubs, and beat poets scribbling on folding chairs. Through it all, a modest brownstone, nestled among painted Victorian homes. This was Catherine's studio. When I arrived, bundled in my frayed coat and second-hand shoes, Catherine greeted me at the door with an appraising smile. She was robust palette of silver curls atop her head and eyes as sharp as her favorite embroidery scissors. "You must be Martha," she said, extending a hand that bore ink-stained fingertips. "I hear you've got talent with lace." I nodded, breathless. She led me inside, where a dozen workstations stood under bright lamps, each occupied by women crafting delicate finishes on bespoke garments. Rolls of chiffon and taffeta lined the walls, and vintage mannequins displayed wedding dresses whose beadwork glimmered like starlight. The air smelled of starch and ambition. "Show me what you can do," Catherine said. Without fanfare, she handed me a small swatch of embroidered tulle and some colored threads. My fingers moved almost instinctively, threading a needle, looping tiny French knots, coaxing a rose petal shape into the mesh. As I worked, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same sense of purpose I'd felt in Louisville and the Bronx, now tinged with the thrill of possibility. Catherine watched in silence, then nodded. "Very nice. I think you'll fit right in. Come back on Monday at 9, and we'll get you started." From that day forward, Catherine became my mentor in the truest sense. She taught me not only the technical precision of couture work, how to create invisible hems, how to select the perfect needle size for each fabric, how to frame an embroidery motif so it followed the gown's natural curves, but also the unspoken craft of client relations, pattern drafting, and even the art of pricing custom work. 1. Technical mastery. Under Catherine's tutelage, I refined stitches I'd only dreamed of, hire-loom handwork that required hours of patient repetition. She showed me how a single misplaced stitch could warp an entire design, and how meticulous blocking and steaming could transform a piece from good to gallery-worthy. 2. Business acumen. Over coffee breaks in her cramped kitchenette, Catherine shared lessons on supply management, invoicing, and client follow-through. "A gorgeous dress is only part of the story," she'd say. "If you miss a deadline or lose a button, you lose trust." 3. Creative confidence. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine taught me to trust my eye. When I hesitated before introducing a bold lace pattern or daring color contrast, she would remind me, "Your instincts brought you here. Don't second-guess them." Her partnership was not born of pity, but of respect, an exchange where she invested her knowledge and I repaid with dedication and fresh ideas. In Catherine's studio, I found a model of what mentorship could be, neither hierarchical nor fleeting, but a sustained relationship built on mutual growth. Expecting instant perfection early on, I pressured myself to perform flawlessly, forgetting that mastery is born of mistakes. Catherine would catch me agonizing over a crooked seam and gently remind me that the most celebrated artisans learned by trial and error. Resisting feedback, when Catherine critiqued my work, my first instinct was to shrink back, interpreting her comments as personal judgments. Over time, I learned to reframe feedback as a gift, a chance to refine my skills rather than a marker of failure. Neglecting patience. I was eager to prove myself, often volunteering for extra tasks. Catherine would smile knowingly and say, "Even plants need time to bloom." It took me months to appreciate the grace of patience. By the end of my first year, I had progressed from simple hem stitching to leading the intricate embroidery on a high-profile wedding dress for a Manhattan debutante. I still remember the thrill of handling yards of silk tulle, of threading hundreds of tiny seed beads by hand under Catherine's watchful eye. When the bride's mother complimented my work, her words felt like the sweetest validation. Yet, beyond the accolades, the real growth came in those quiet moments when a difficult technique finally clicked, when a client's sketch evolved into a living garment, when the other seamstresses began asking my opinion on color combinations. I had found not only a job, but a calling to shape cloth into art, to translate dreams into form, to build beauty from thread and human ingenuity. As my confidence soared, I felt a pull to pay that mentorship forward. I started informally guiding a younger seamstress named Rita, who had emigrated from Puerto Rico with only basic sewing skills. Together, we would practice buttonholes and bias binding during lunch breaks. In time, Rita succeeded me on afternoon shifts, her hands blossoming under my encouragement. I also volunteered to mentor new hires, sharing the grounding techniques I'd learned in therapy whenever someone seemed overwhelmed by the pace of couture work. Watching others grow reminded me of how far I'd come, from a trembling girl in Oakwood to a skilled artisan in New York's fashion scene. Seek mentors who challenge and inspire. Catherine challenged me technically and encouraged me emotionally. A true mentor stretches you, not just supports you. Embrace feedback as fuel for growth. Feedback stung at first, but over time became the compass guiding me toward excellence. Be patient with the process. Progress often hides within small improvements. Celebrate them. Pay it forward. Sharing your skills and empathy with others extends the cycle of mentorship and builds community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how this partnership with Catherine evolved into a formal studio of our own, when she offered me the chance to become her business partner and begin charting a legacy that would carry into the coming decades. We'll see how two women, bound not by blood, but by shared dreams, transformed a modest Greenwich Village atelier into a beacon of handcrafted elegance. It was the spring of 1983 when I received the news my mother, the steadfast heart of our family, was gravely ill. The letter arrived at the studio in Greenwich Village, a clumsy scrawl on a yellowed postcard urging me to come home at once. Though I had not been back to Kentucky in nearly 2 decades, those words awakened a deep ache inside me. If ever there was a moment to confront the ghosts of my past, it was now. I closed the studio for a week, entrusting Catherine and our apprentices with orders and fittings, and boarded a flight south. As the plane descended over the rolling green hills of Kentucky, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, equal parts excitement and dread. Could I face the place, and the people I had once fled? Could I bring my aging mother the comfort she deserved? And could I finally forgive the man who had once been both my protector and my destroyer? Louisville itself had changed in my absence. New highways, shopping malls, and office buildings that rose like glass and steel monuments. But the streets near my aunt's old neighborhood and the side roads leading toward Oakwood still held echoes of a simpler time. I rented a car and drove down State Route 44, heart pounding, as mile markers passed under the windshield. When I crossed the bridge over the Ohio River, I told myself I was not the same frightened girl in a frayed coat. I was a woman who had built a life of her own, and this journey was an act of love, not of fear. I arrived at my mother's bedside in a low-income clinic on the outskirts of the city. She lay frail but alert, her once strong hands now bone-thin, her white hair a soft halo on the pillow. When she saw me, her eyes lit up with a warmth that made me realize no distance, no time, no tragedy could ever erase the bond between mother and daughter. "Martha," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "You came home." Tears welled in my eyes as I bent to kiss her forehead. "For you, Mom, always." Over the next several days, we spoke in quiet tones about memories, both tender and painful. My mother apologized once haltingly for the pain she could not prevent, and I forgave her for the things she had done and left unspoken. We laughed over childhood stories, the time I tried to dye my hair with beet juice, the impromptu dance parties in the kitchen, the way she always tucked my blanket in at night. We cried over the losses we had both endured, my father's descent into rage, John's tragic death, the child I never held. In my mother's gaze, I saw the reflection of the little girl I had once been, still alive beneath the scars. That recognition that shared sorrow and love became a bridge between our past and whatever future remained. It was in those conversations that I first understood forgiveness, not as forgetting, but as choosing to release the weight of anger and grief so we could breathe more freely. With my mother's blessing, I made arrangements to visit Oakwood, specifically the cemetery where John, and years later, my father found their final resting places. My mother, too weak to travel, asked me to go on her behalf. "Deliver my love to him," she said softly, "and tell him I forgive him." I drove the familiar dirt roads to Oakwood, my heart thrumming with every turn. The old church steeple still stood, sentinel, over the town square, and the same cobblestone streets bore the footprints of my youth. When I reached the cemetery, a modest field of headstones, shaded by ancient oaks, I paused at the entrance, drawing in a breath, as though summoning the courage for the steps ahead. I found John's grave, first a simple white marker etched with his name, birth and death dates, in a small engraved camera. I knelt before it, hands trembling, and laid a single white rose atop the grass. "John," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "I've carried your memory with me every day. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry we never had our life together. But I forgive you for any pain my choices caused, because without you, I would never have learned who I truly am." Tears fell as I felt a shift inside me, as though an unspoken bond between us had eased its grip on my heart. In that moment, reconciliation was not about righting wrongs in the world, but about freeing my own spirit from endless regret. I rose from John's grave and walked a few steps further to my father's headstone. It was a larger monument inscribed with his name and the dates of his life and nothing more. I remembered his face, On that terrible day, contorted with rage, a shotgun still smoking in his hand. Yet here, beneath the shade of that oak tree, stood a man who was once my protector, my teacher, and in his own tragic way, my greatest sorrow. I placed my hand on the cool stone and closed my eyes. "Father," I began, voice small, "I don't know if you understand the harm you caused. You ripped away my love, my future, and nearly my life." I paused, collecting myself. "But I also know that anger destroys the soul faster than any weapon. I forgive you, not because you deserved it, but because I deserve to live unburdened by hate. I release you, and I release myself." In the hush of that cemetery, I felt a profound calm settle over me. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a journey, a gentle unwrapping of layers of pain until the heart can rest once more. What does it mean to forgive? In the years since I've come to see it as an art form, one requiring empathy, courage, and a willingness to transform suffering into compassion. Forgiveness does not erase the past or condone wrongdoing. It simply frees us from the prison of resentment. When we forgive, we acknowledge our pain, honor the depth of our loss, and then choose to step forward with hope. I learned that forgiving my mother, John, and even my father, created space in my heart to love more fully, to embrace the life I had built, to cherish the friendships I had forged, and to give with an open hand instead of clutching at old wounds. When I returned to Louisville to say goodbye to my mother, whose health had declined faster than any of us expected, I did so with a heart that felt lighter. In the quiet of her hospital room, I told her about the visit to the cemetery, how I left flowers on both graves, and how I felt a peace that I never thought possible. Her eyes, moist with tears, shone with pride. "You are my daughter," she whispered, "and you have found your way home in more ways than one." She passed a week later under a rosewood tree in the clinic's courtyard, her hand in mine. I thanked her for teaching me love, for sheltering me, and for giving me the courage to forgive. As her breath slowed, I felt both sorrow and gratitude wash over me, knowing that her legacy lived on in every stitch I made, every story I told, and every heart I touched. Forgiveness is for the forgiver. It's not about excusing harm, but about releasing the emotional chains that bind us. Face the past with compassion. A pilgrimage, literal or metaphorical, can bring closure and clarity. Honor every emotion. Grief, anger, guilt, they all deserve acknowledgement before forgiveness can bloom. Forgive actively, not passively. Speak the words, perform the ritual, and choose to let go. Embrace renewal. In freeing our hearts, we make room for joy, creativity, and connection. In our final chapter, we'll return to the present moment, exploring how, even at age 78, I continue to weave the threads of my past into a tapestry of resilience, beauty, and purpose. We'll reflect on the legacy of a life shaped by love loss and the enduring power of forgiveness, and we'll consider the lessons it offers to each of us, no matter where our own journeys have taken us. After Catherine retired and entrusted her beloved studio to my capable hands, I found myself facing a choice: continue the frenetic pace of New York's fashion world, or return to Kentucky to be closer to family in the pace of my own breathing. In 2020, 5 years ago now, I decided to make Lexington home. My small but sun-filled apartment overlooks a quiet street lined with maple trees, whose leaves turn gold each autumn, just as the maples in Oakwood once did. It feels like a circle, completed a homecoming, not just of geography, but of spirit. Each morning, I wake to the soft light of dawn, filtering through lace curtains, the distant song of a cardinal on the neighbor's fence. I brew a pot of coffee, sit at my little wooden table, and open the scrapbook of John's photographs, reminders of our brief but profound time together. Then I pick up my needle and thread, because even at my age, the quiet work of stitching brings me solace and a sense of purpose. It is in these simple routines that I feel most deeply connected to every chapter of my life, from that curious girl in Oakwood to the woman I am today. Though Catherine's original studio shuttered its doors years ago, its spirit thrives in a small workshop I maintain in my home. Twice a week, I host a gathering of local crafters and emerging designers, young women and men who, like me once did, are finding their way through the craft of needle and cloth. We share patterns, techniques, and stories over mugs of tea and plates of shortbread. I teach them heirloom embroidery, and they teach me about the latest textile innovations and sustainable materials. It's a beautiful fusion of tradition and innovation, proof that the art we love can adapt and flourish across generations. I also mentor 2 apprentices who show particular promise. Watching them transform a flat swath of fabric into a delicate garment reminds me of my own early days under Catherine's guidance. My greatest joy is seeing their eyes light up when a complex stitch finally clicks into place. If I have learned anything from my own journey, it is that mentorship is a gift that keeps on giving, anchoring us to community and nurturing the next wave of dreamers. Storytelling has become as important to me as stitching. In addition to my crafting circle, I volunteer at the Lexington Public Library, hosting monthly Memoir Moments workshops, where anyone young or old can share a personal anecdote, big or small, and learn the basics of preserving it in writing. We talk about how memory works, how detail breathes life into our recollections, and how the act of telling can be healing. Many participants discover that the smallest moments, a grandmother's lullaby, a grandfather's worn hat, a childhood hiding place, carry universal truths about love loss and resilience. It thrills me to witness a teenager write for the first time about the courage it took to stand up to a bully, or an older man recalling the day he eloped with his high school sweetheart. These stories remind me that though our circumstances differ, the human heart echoes the same hopes and fears across time. I see in their faces the same spark. I once had something bright and curious that refuses to be dimmed. Looking back on the darkest moments, John's death, the attack that cost me my child, the years of chronic pain and fear, I sometimes marvel at the alchemy of survival. How does a soul transmute tragedy into beauty? For me, the answer has always been twofold: creation and connection. When I thread a needle and coax a pattern into being, I transform emptiness into form. When I share a story or a stitch with another person, I exchange isolation for fellowship. In the advocacy circle of the library and local women's center, I've also spoken about domestic violence and trauma recovery, drawing on my own experiences to offer empathy and practical resources. I emphasize that trauma is not a source of shame, but a call to community, to lean on one another, to seek help, and to reclaim agency. I share hotlines and support groups for anyone in need because I know how crucial it is to hear the words, "You are not alone." If there is a single thread that ties together everything I've learned over these 78 years, it is this: embrace your story. Every life has chapters of light and shadow. By acknowledging both, we give ourselves permission to grow and heal. Find your craft, whether it's stitching, writing, building models, or coding software. A craft anchors your identity and offers a sense of purpose. Invest in it and let it speak for you when words fall short. Cultivate community. Seek out mentors, become a mentor, and build circles of trust. No one is meant to journey alone, and each connection enriches your path. Practice forgiveness. This includes forgiving others and yourself. Forgiveness isn't about condoning harm. It's about releasing emotional burdens so we can live more freely. Keep curiosity alive. From the girl who dreamed of Paris and New York to the woman who now hosts memoir workshops, curiosity has been my compass. Let it guide you beyond your comfort zone. Turn pain into purpose. Use your trials to fuel empathy and service. Helping others heal can be one of the greatest acts of resilience. I often wonder what footprint a life like mine leaves on this earth. I do not envision grand monuments or best-selling memoirs. Rather, I see a rippling effect. The apprentice who goes on to open her own atelier. The teenager who finds solace in writing and becomes a therapist. The neighbor who learns basic embroidery and discovers unexpected confidence. These small transformations, born of shared stories and shared stitches, feel like the truest legacy. My wish is that long after I'm gone, someone will find a delicate needlepoint pillow with my initials in a thrift shop and feel compelled to learn the craft. I hope my scrapbooks, letters, and sketches remain tucked away in some family attic, waiting for a curious descendant to unearth them and say, "Grandma Martha led a remarkable life." In that moment of discovery, the threads of my story would weave once more into a new narrative, proof that lives like fabrics, endure through folds of time. To each of you who've accompanied me through these chapters, I offer my deepest gratitude. Your presence, your listening heart, and your willingness to journey with an old woman sharing memories remind me that stories are the real treasures of our world. When you tell your own story or listen to another's, you are weaving the fabric of community thread by precious thread. May your days be filled with curiosity, compassion, and the quiet joy of creation. And when life's storms come, as they inevitably do, may you find in your own heart the strength to mend the grace, to forgive, and the courage to begin anew. From Lexington, Kentucky, as the afternoon light softens into dusk, I send you my love and my blessings. Remember, a single stitch, a single story can change everything. Thank you for letting me share mine.